Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about using high rep band work to strengthen connective tissue. It's something that I've been doing a lot lately for my arms, for obvious reasons, which we've discussed, particularly things like the biceps, in order to help protect the bicep tendon against tears, in addition to being careful in the way that I set my arms up on a deadlift. And I've had people ask, could you explain this a little bit better? And I think I could do a video doing that, showing some of the clips of me doing it. And you could find ways to do this for various muscles. It's just very, very easy, obviously, for upper body stuff. And I also have at least one client with a herniated disc who we actually do this with bands on good mornings, and he's found a way to set them up. But that's not as easy to set up as something like this. It's going to take a little practice to do it on something like that, and the effect may not be as pronounced. But when we're doing these, we need to define what we mean by eccentric versus concentric, because normally you'll see a lot of bodybuilders and other people, they'll talk about eccentric reps and like, oh yeah, the eccentric rep carries a big growth response, but they don't understand that the studies on the eccentric show that yeah, it contributes some under normal conditions, but what they show is that when you really slow it down, it doesn't do anything. So you'll see bodybuilders and people who will misinterpret that as if they do a really slow eccentric, like 4 seconds, 5 seconds down, they're getting more muscle growth than 1 second down. And the reality is the data doesn't support that. Okay, it does not support that. Now, sometimes you might need to go slower to learn to control a weight, right? There are exercises which a person needs a slower eccentric to not get hurt, or to have better control or tightness on certain exercises, but it's not necessarily giving more growth. What we find is that when they overload the eccentric, well, when the eccentric is overloaded, and what we mean by that is a weight you can't handle. In other words, if your bench press 5 rep max is 225, when they add 10% to that, right, you take it up to 245, 250, and they have a machine like a forklift lift the weight, and then you take it and then lower it. They pull the bars out and let you lower 5 reps with a weight that's 10% heavier than, say, your normal 5 rep max, and you lower it for 5 reps under control. It produces a pretty good growth response without doing the concentric rep. But you're also using a weight you're not capable of lifting. That's what they found in studies for eccentric overload. So we have to define that. We have to understand what eccentric overload is. So let's come over to the bands. Okay, what do we see happening here? We're getting, because of band work, and this is stuff that we originally learned from powerlifting and strength sports, which is my area. We've learned over the years that bands can create overspeed eccentrics when we hook them over barbells. Okay, it's why we do speed work with bands. Speed squats, speed deadlifts, speed benches, speed overhead press. That when the weight hits the top and the bands are at peak tension, when it gets reversed, it can create an overspeed eccentric. What does that mean? That means the bands jerk you down through several inches, or at least part of the range of motion. They jerk you down at a faster than free fall speed. Okay, most of you guys understand that when you release an object and let it drop, there's a calculation, which, calculus is largely based upon, determining drop rates. You have a free fall speed. Usually early on in the range of motion, when you have an overspeed eccentric from bands, for part of the way, you are getting faster than free fall speed. So it's the same thing up here on these band press downs. It's jerking me back up right after the lockout. When the bands start to come back up, it's actually pulling faster than if I was just letting my arms or holding a barbell or whatever drop down. This creates a more pronounced eccentric effect because you're not loose, like you're controlling it. It's just that you're being pulled. Well, that creates a very large amount of micro tearing in the muscles. You're getting an eccentric effect, and people know that eccentric loading does cause more micro tearing in muscles. More importantly, causes micro tearing in connective tissue. Tendons, the fascia of the muscle fibers, get a lot of microtraumas as a result of eccentric loading. It's one reason when you do too much eccentric work, you get more DOMs. It's also very associated with DOMS, and they find, again, there's micro tearing in the tendons and the fascia, particularly sometimes where the fascia start inserting all along the tendons, where it weaves into the muscle. We get a lot of microtraumas. So, people want to talk about doing, this or that for fascia stretching. Why don't you do overspeed work? Why don't you do heavy eccentrics? That would do it. But your body has to compensate for that. So if you're doing this overspeed work, what happens? You're creating damage. You're creating microtraumas to your connective tissue. Now, normally that could be a recovery issue if we're doing it with really heavy weight. But what happens when we deal with high rep work? All right, a lot of times your connective tissue doesn't have the best blood flow to it. This helps build blood flow. It helps build capillary beds all through the muscles. We create better blood flow to the tendons because of the really, really high rep nature of the resistance, which is great for things like muscles around the elbow, which are commonly a weak point, or tendons around there, connective tissue of the low back, possibly the pectoral. Anything that is prone to tearing or has work capacity issues. Okay, low back tends to be work capacity issues, affects recovery. So you can find a way to do stuff like this for that, which again, I usually have people just do really, really high rep good mornings. Come back over to not the micro tearing part, but what? The blood flow. The low back is largely connective tissue, not as much muscle as you would think. And it has recovery issues due to lack of blood flow to all that connective tissue at times. So things like this improve the work capacity, they improve the blood flow, improve the creation of capillaries and things near that tissue, a small amount. That increases recovery. So if we can take tendons and we can cause adaptative stress by microtraumas, which again, large amounts, high reps of overspeed eccentrics. So the fascia, where all the tendons insert, the tendons themselves, creating microtraumas, while potentially increasing the blood flow to those areas. What do we get from that? Well, in theory, it's a hypothetical. I'm not using theory, it's a hypothesis. It's based upon a pretty good amount of anecdote coaches have noted over the decades, especially since the implementation of bands and things. Pretty well noted, does seem to help. So in doing this, we're attempting to have better injury prevention. We're attempting to have better injury prevention. Now, the other thing to factor in, if we're doing this for muscles that have weak tendons, in many cases, for some of us, it's the weaker connective tissue that may be a factor in why those muscles grow slower for us. I don't have particularly good arm development. In fact, it's a point where people love to talk about it, right? His torso's so big he has no arms, he should train his arms. And they act like I haven't done thousands and thousands of curls in my life, right? So what we're often dealing with too is weaker connective tissue can limit force production. And it's indirectly, it's because your brain perceives it. And so therefore you might have a muscle that might lag more because of the weak connective tissue. And in fact, I find that oftentimes when I have even advanced lifters, when we start working on their weak points, they get really sore tendons and everything when we start really hitting their weak points. Why is that? Well, because maybe their tendons were always weak, and that's why that muscle ended up being underdeveloped, and it ends up being their weak link on their bench press, their squat, or whatever. So again, the things can tie together hand in hand. And this is the sort of thing that we would look at. If your biceps really are weak link, maybe you need to be doing this. Triceps are weak link, maybe you need to be doing this. And then you need to have that to help protect the connective tissue. Because if your biceps are weak because of weak tendons or smaller tendons and connective tissue over time, you are at a higher risk of tearing a bicep on big movements like your deadlifts. You are at a higher risk of getting elbow tendonitis on your bench pressing, so on and so forth. And again, arms are the easiest one to do. You have to be creative to do this stuff for other muscle groups. It can be done, but you have to be creative. It's going to be very dependent on what equipment you have available. These can be done easily with just bands. So, in short, we're dealing with potential injury prevention. right? And bringing up weak points. As far as the actual anabolic effect, that would be a totally separate topic. It's something I could make another video on later, but a lot of that would just have to do with bringing up weak points and rep ranges and training modalities in order to try to bring up a lagging muscle through any means necessary. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.